Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned had described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we'll endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we're talking about the Hartford Circus fire. Now, the Hartford Circus fire, which occurred on July 6 of 1944 in Hartford, Connecticut, was one of the worst fire disasters in United States history. The fire occurred during an afternoon performance of the Ringling Bros and Barnum Bailey Circus that was attended by 6,000 to 8,000 people. The fire killed at least 167 people and more than 700 were injured. It was the deadliest disaster ever recorded in Connecticut. Now we come to the background of this case. In mid-20th century United States, a typical circus travelled from town to town by train, performing under a huge canvas tent commonly called a big top. The Ringling Bros and Barnum Bailey Circus was no exception, and what made it stand out was that it was the largest circus in the country. The circus had been experiencing shortages of personnel and equipment as a result of the United States' involvement in World War II. Delays and malfunctions in the ordinarily smooth order of the circus had become commonplace. On August 4th of 1942, a fire had broken out in the menagerie, killing a number of animals. When the circus arrived in Hartford, Connecticut on July 5th of 1944, the trains were so late that one of the 2 shows scheduled for that day had been cancelled. Now, interestingly enough, and I didn't know this until researching this case, in circus superstition, missing a show is considered extremely bad luck, and although the July 5th, 1944 evening show ran as planned, many circus employees may have been on their guard, half expecting an emergency or catastrophe. The next day was a Thursday. The crowd at the 2:15 afternoon performance was dominated by women and children. The size of the audience that day has never been established with certainty, but the best estimate is about 7,000 people. Now we come to the big top layout. The big top could seat 9,000 spectators around its 3 rings and measured 200 feet wide by 450 feet long. It had 15-foot high side walls and its roof was 48 feet high. The tent's canvas had been coated with 1,800 pounds or 820 kilos of paraffin wax dissolved in 6,000 US gallons or 23,000 litres of gasoline, a common waterproofing method of the time. The big top had been erected over freshly mowed grass and exposed dirt that had been watered down and then covered with hay and wood shavings. Inside the tent there were 3 rings and 2 stages with a 20-foot wide oval-shaped track separating the performance area and seating, which could either be bleacher or unsecured folding chairs. One could exit the tent by either a main entrance or 8 other smaller exits. However, during the fire, many of the alternative exits were blocked by circus wagons or other items. Now we come to the fire. The fire began as a small flamer after the lions performed on the southwest side wall of the tent while the Flying Waldeners were performing. Circus band leader Merle Evans was said to have been the first to spot the flames and immediately directed the band to play The Stars and Stripes Forever, a musical composition that traditionally signaled distress to all circus personnel. Ringmaster Fred Brander urged the audience not to panic and to leave in an orderly fashion, but the fire had shorted out the power and he could not be heard. Bradner and the ushers unsuccessfully tried to maintain some order as the panicked crowd tried to flee the big top. The ushers also worked to attempt to douse the fire with water jugs that had been stationed in the big top and to pull down the canvas sections that were on fire. After realizing their attempts were futile, however, they began to help evacuate the crowds. The only animals in the big top at the time were the big cats trained by May Kovar and Joseph Walsh that had just finished performing when the fire started. The big cats were herded through the chutes leading from the performing cages to several cage wagons and were unharmed except for a few minor burns. Though most spectators were able to escape the fire, many people were caught up in the hysteria. Witnesses said some simply ran around in circles trying to find their loved ones rather than try to escape from the burning tent. Some escaped but ran back inside to look for family members. Others stayed in their seats until it was was too late, assuming that the fire would be put out promptly. Because at least 2 of the exits were blocked by the chutes used to bring the show's big cats in and out of the tent, people trying to escape could not bypass them. Survivor Maureen Creekhan was 11 at the time of the fire and lived on the same road on which the circus was held. On the day of the event, she was supposed to go to the circus with a neighbour and her daughter. When she went to their house, she found that they'd already left without her. She decided to go to the circus on her own, where she seated herself in the bleachers. Quote, I remember somebody yelling and seeing a big ball of fire near the top of the tent, and this ball of fire just got bigger and bigger and bigger. By that time, everybody was panicking. The exit was blocked with the cages that the animals were brought in and out with, and there was a man taking kids and flinging them up over the cage to get them out. I was sitting up in the bleachers and jumped down. I was 3/4 of the way up. You jumped down and it was all straw underneath. There was a young man, a kid, and he had a pocket knife, and he slit the tent, took my arm and pulled me out, end quote. As she was being pulled out, Creekin grabbed another little girl's arm and pulled her out as well. Frida Pushnik, who performed with the circus as the armless and legless wonder, was rescued by a minstrel show performer who rushed on the stage, picked up Pushnik's chair and carried her to safety. Pushnik continued to perform with the circus until 1955. Others, such as Judah Shapiro Cohen, who was about 7 years old, were taken higher up into the stands and instructed to jump off the bleachers. Being afraid to do so, Judith refused to jump and instead was pushed off, landing on a chair underneath. Because of the paraffin wax waterproofing of the tent, the flames spread rapidly, helped by the wind. The waterproofing indeed protected the tent from the rain, but as had been repeatedly shown, it was highly flammable. Many people were badly burned by the melting paraffin, which rained down from the roof. The fiery tent collapsed in about 8 minutes, according to eyewitnesses, survivors, trapping hundreds of spectators underneath. Because of a picture that appeared in several newspapers of sad tramp clown Emmett Kelly holding a water bucket, the event became known as the Day the Clowns Cried. Now we come to the victims in this case. While many people burned to death, others died as a result of the ensuing chaos. Sources and investigators differ on how many people were killed and injured. Various people and organisations say it was 167, 168 or 169 persons. The 168 figure is usually based on official tallies that included a collection of body parts that were listed as a victim, with official treated injury estimates running over 700 people. The number of actual injuries is believed to be higher than those figures, since many people were seen that day heading home in shock without seeking treatment in the city. It's commonly believed that the number of fatalities is higher than the estimates given due to poorly kept residency records in rural towns and the fact that some smaller remains were never identified or claimed. Additionally, free tickets had been handed out that day to many people in and around the city, some of whom appeared to eyewitnesses and circus employees to be drifters who would never have been reported missing. Some died from injuries sustained after leaping from the top of the bleachers in hopes they could escape under the sides of the tent, though that method of escape ended up killing more than it saved. Others died after being trampled by other spectators, with some asphyxiating underneath the piles of people who fell over each other. Most of the dead were found in piles, some 3 bodies deep, at the most congested exits. A small number of people were found alive at the bottom of these piles, protected by the bodies on top of them when the burning big top ultimately fell down. Notable survivors included Eunice Gorak, first female lieutenant governor of Connecticut, the Flying Weldoners, Charles Nelson Riley, actor, comedian and director, and Emmett Kelly, renowned circus clown. Those who survived carried the trauma for decades. 70 years after the fire, Carol Tillman Parrish, who was 6 at the time, said that, quote, "Until this day I can smell the stench of human flesh as the blaze consumed its victims," end quote. Now we come to a little mystery in this case that no one has ever gotten to the bottom of, although various people have tried, that being Little Miss 1565. The best known victim of the circus fire was a young blonde girl wearing a white dress. She's known only as Little Miss 1565, named after the number assigned to her body at the city's makeshift morgue. Oddly well preserved even after her death, her face has arguably become the most familiar image of the fire. Her true identity has been a topic of debate and frustration in the Hartford area since the fire occurred. She was buried without a name in Hartford's Northwood Cemetery, where a victim's memorial also stands. 2 police investigators, Sergeants Thomas Barber and Edward Lowe, photographed her and took fingerprints, footprints and dental charts. Despite massive publicity and repeated displays of the famous photograph in nationwide magazines, she was never claimed. Barber and Lowe spent the rest of their lives trying to identify her. They decorated her grave with flowers each Christmas, Memorial Day and July 4th. After their deaths, a local flower company continued to decorate the grave. Now we come to proposed identifications of the poor little girl. In 1981, Lowe's widow announced that Lowe had actually identified the child and contacted her family, but they had requested no publicity. In 1987, someone left a note on the 1565 gravestone reading, quote, "Sarah Graham is her name, 7638, DOB, 6 years, twin," end quote. Notes on nearby gravestones indicated that her twin brother and other relatives were buried close by. In 1991, arson investigator Rick Davey, along with co-writer Don Massey, published A Matter of Degree, The Hartford Circus Fire and Mystery of Little Miss 1565, in which he claims the girl was Eleanor Emily Cook and from Massachusetts. Davey also contends that there was a conspiracy within the judicial system to convict the Ringling defendants, and that CG was the arsonist. Before writing the book, Davey spent 6 years researching the case and conducting his own experiments as to how the fire really may have started. He described the original investigation as both flawed and primitive, though he did not work on the original case. Eleanor Cook's brother, Donald Cook, had contacted authorities in 1955, insisting that the girl was his sister, but nothing strangely came of it, and Donald later worked with Davey to establish her identity. Donald believes that family members were shown the wrong body in the confusion at the morgue. In 1991, the body was declared to be that of 8-year-old Eleanor Emily Cook, though Cook's aunt and uncle had examined the body and it did not fit the description they provided. The Connecticut State Police Forensics Unit compared the hair samples and determined they were probably from the same person. The body was exhumed in 1991 and buried next to her brother Edward, who had also died in the fire. Now we come to the ongoing questions. Various assertions put forth in A Matter of Degree have been fiercely disputed by investigators who worked on the case, as well as by other writers, most notably Stuart Onan, who published The Circus Fire, A True Story of an American Tragedy in 2001. Onan points to the fact that Little Miss 1565 had blonde hair while Eleanor Cook was a brunette. The shape of Little Miss 1565's face and that of Eleanor Cook were dissimilar, and the heights and ages of the two girls do not match. Perhaps most significantly, when shown a photograph of Little Miss 1565, Eleanor's mother, Mildred Corthinthia Parsons Cook, immediately stated that it was not that of her daughter. She firmly maintained that stance until her death in 1997 at the age of 91. Badly injured in the fire, Mrs. Cook had been unable to claim her two dead children and was too emotionally traumatized to pursue it later. She had been told that Eleanor was not in any of the locations where bodies were kept for identification. She believed that Eleanor was one of the two children who had been burned beyond recognition and remain unidentified. Onan thinks that Eleanor Cook may be body number 1503. He further points to the differences in the dental records of Eleanor Cook and the records made of Little Miss 1565 after her death. As Onan and others have pointed out, the most likely scenario is that a family claiming a body early on mistakenly identified Eleanor Cook as their own child, and that she is buried under that child's name. Even when Little Miss 1565's picture ran in the papers, the family failed to recognize her as their own because they wished to put the traumatic event behind them. While DNA analysis could end this debate definitively, the logistics of exhuming all of the likely candidates in this potential mix-up make such an undertaking unlikely. With the true identity of Little Miss 65 still unresolved for many, the body was exhumed after the release of A Matter of Degree and buried in Southampton, Massachusetts, next to the body of Edward Cook, the brother of Eleanor Cook and a victim of the circus fire himself. In 1992, her death certificate was officially changed from the previous identification of 1565. Since then, the Cook family has raised questions about whether the body is indeed that of Eleanor Cook, and some investigators have come to believe that Eleanor's body may have been among the fire's unclaimed bodies and was not that of Little Miss 1565. Now we come to the investigation of the fire. Interestingly enough, the cause of the fire remains unsolved. Investigators at the time believed it was caused by a carelessly flicked cigarette, however others suspected an arsonist. In 1950, while being investigated on other arson charges, Robert Dale Segui, 1929 to 1997, who was an adolescent at the time of the fire, confessed to starting the blaze. He was never tried for the crime and later recanted his confession. Although the circus accepted full responsibility for the financial damages, it did not accept responsibility for the disaster itself. The 5 men charged were brought to trial in late 1944 and 4 were convicted. Although the 4 were given prison terms, they were allowed to continue with the circus to its next stop, Sarasota, Florida, to help the company set itself up again after the disaster. Shortly after their convictions, they were pardoned entirely. One of the men, James A. Haley, went on to serve in the US House of Representatives for 24 years. Now we come to C.G.'s confession. In 1950, Robert Dale C.G. of Circleville, Ohio, claimed during a police interview that he was responsible for setting the fire. Following the interview, C.G. signed a statement admitting to setting the circus fire, a series of other fires, and several murders since his youth. C.G., a 16-year-old roustabout for the show from June 30th to July 14th of 1944, claimed that he had a nightmare in which an American Indian riding on a flaming horse had told him to set fires. According to police authorities, C.G. further stated that after his nightmare his mind went blank, and by the time it cleared, the circus fire had been set. Some of C.G.'s handwritten images of his bizarre dreams and images depicting his claimed murders appeared in Life on July 17th of 1950. In November 1950, C.G. was convicted in Ohio of unrelated arson charges and sentenced to 44 years of prison time. However, Hartford investigators raised doubts over his confession as he had a history of mental illness and it could not be proven that he was in Connecticut when the fire occurred. Connecticut officials were also not allowed to question C.G. even though his alleged crime had occurred in their state. C.G., who died in 1997, denied setting the fire as late as 1994 during an interview. Because of this, many investigators, historians and victims believe that the true arsonist, if it had indeed been arson, was never found. And now we come to the legal consequences of this case. On July 7th of 1944, charges of involuntary manslaughter were filed against 5 officials and employees of Ringling Bros. Within the ensuing days, the circus reached an agreement with Hartford officials to accept full financial responsibility and pay whatever amount the city requested in damages. The circus paid almost $5 million to the 600 victims and families who had filed claims against them by 1954. All circus profits from the time of the fire until then had been set aside to pay off these claims. Now we come to the aftermath. While many of those present at the fire have avoided circuses ever since, others have returned. In May 2004, Dorothy Carvey and her son, Tiggy, were given free passes for their family by Ringling Brothers to attend a show at the XL Center. For Dorothy Carvey, this was her first time attending a circus since the fire occurred. The Hartford Courant published a story of their visit as well as what happened to them in 1944. In 2002, the Hartford Circus Fire Memorial Foundation was established to erect a permanent memorial to the people killed in the fire. Ground was broken for the monument on July 6 of 2004 at the site where the fire occurred. Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey visited Hartford during its final tour, putting on its final performance there on April 30th of 2017. How was the fire started? Who started the fire, and was it started by an arsonist or was it a simple accident? Well, we may never know for sure, and unfortunately that answer may be lost to time itself. With that, this case remains open, with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate this show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions Podcast. Until next time, next on Unanswered Questions. James Joseph Dresnock, born November 24th of 1941 and died November 2016, was an American defected to North Korea, one of 7 US soldiers to defect after the Korean War.